All right. Hello, my name is Lucy Diekmann, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to Racial Equity in Food Systems Work, Beginning the Journey. This webinar is presented jointly by Michigan State University's Center for Regional Food Systems and the Working Group on Undoing Inequality in the Food System. This working group is part of a larger e-extension community of practice that's dedicated to community, local, and regional food systems. And funding for the webinar comes in part from a grant from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation that was received by MSU Center for Regional Food Systems. Next slide. Before we get into the substance of our webinar for today, I want to very briefly introduce our working group on undoing inequality in the food system. This group started in late 2016 and is intended to be a place for extension educators and others who have an interest in the ways in which racial equity intersects with food system work, to connect, to learn, and hopefully to collaborate. Currently, we have a national steering committee made up of 5 members, in addition to myself, and I am located at Santa Clara University in California. We have Shorlette Ammons with NC State University, Rachel Lindvall with Rosebud Reservation Extension and South Dakota State University, as well as Rich Pirog and Kelsey Watson, who are with MSU's Center for Regional Food Systems. Thanks to MSU, we have some funding to increase the capacity of our working group, and we are really excited to look at ways that we can strengthen and expand our work. One small first step in this process is coming up with a new name. And so we'll be asking for your feedback on a few possibilities toward the end of the webinar. More broadly speaking, we're very interested to learn how we can best support you in this type of work. And so I hope you'll share any suggestions you may have either later in the webinar or anytime afterwards via email. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Shorlette Ammons. Shorlette is the Equity in Food Systems Coordinator and Core Team Lead for the Center for Environmental Farming Systems at NC State University. Thank you, Shorlette, and with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So thank you all for having us, and thank you for joining us today, and looking forward to hopefully some questions later, and we'll just dive right in. So the purpose of this webinar is to give you a general overview of what's involved in racial equity training, why it's important as a start, why it's important to start with racial equity training, and why it's important to our overall food systems work. I believe that there are several layers or approaches to this conversation and to this work, and to racial equity itself. What we're offering today through this webinar is one of many approaches within the constraints and the realities of our institutions. And the way we approach them within our institutions is limited by the institutions themselves. And what I mean by that is, whenever we do racial equity trainings, we often hear people say, I don't have the power to make the kinds of changes in my organization that I think need to be made, or within my institution. So the key word there for us is power. So the question becomes, what is in your power to do? What is in the power of your organization to do and to shift? That's why beginning your racial equity in food systems journey in your organization starts with a willingness amongst a strong cohort, and then an understanding of who you have the power in your organizations to influence, and then from there building a shared analysis, which you also gain through the training. All of that collaboratively is key, in my opinion. So in extension, we have a history of focusing on behavior change, changing habits, or either encouraging people to create new habits. Like, for example, how do we get people to eat more vegetables? How do we get kids to have more vegetables on their plate? Or how do we get people to be more physically active? Or how do we get people to create or get in the habit of creating a monthly budget? Which is cool. All that is definitely necessary. But when we talk about racial equity training, we're talking about ways of creating systems change within current food system structures, and that includes our own institutions. So how can we structure our institutional values and priorities differently so that people of color have access to more opportunities in the food system? So these are some of the goals for today. I kind of mentioned them a little like a slide ago, but so first is to understand what a racial equity training is, what are the goals of a training are, and why it's important to our extension and other food systems work, because I understand that not everybody on the webinar is with extension. So hopefully it's relevant to all of us. And then we'll introduce a few tools and resources that can support your initial racial equity practice, just kind of a jumping off point. And then also another goal is to support creating a community of practice within extension. And hopefully this working group will be able to support that in some ways. And then we want to share some lessons learned. And then at the very end, we'll give you some future opportunities to engage in order to build on our racial equity institutional efforts within extension. And I would add that an additional goal of these trainings is to support and build capacity to confront and disrupt the culture of white supremacy, which is deeply embedded within our institutions. History has shown us that that culture can manifest in very heinous and cruel and violent ways. So we don't want to sleep on that. We don't want to get it twisted and just kind of skate over that when we're talking about racism and racial equity. And it's also so pervasive that it kind of has become the norm within our institutions, and it shows up as some of these qualities that you see on the screen that then become operational norms. It's kind of like the big old elephant in the room, and people are sitting around the table with the elephant's trunk draped on the table asking, what elephant? So the training supports us in building capacity to develop new practices to disrupt these cultural norms and create a new inclusive culture within our institutions, our organizations, and then eventually and hopefully within our food system. All right, so in our training, the first thing we do is try to start to do that, try to start to create that new and inclusive culture. So studies show that having difficult conversations or having conversations involving difficult or challenging topics like race or racism can impede or even impair effective communication, let alone be constructive. So like, for example, have you ever been in a situation where somebody says something offensive or out of the way or like straight up wrong and you just freeze? And then after you leave the situation, it could be like an hour or even a day or so later, you're like, man, I wish I would have said this, or wish I would have said that. So when that feeling of anxiety rushes over you, your brain is working really hard to do four things. One part of your brain is controlling your ability to listen. Another part of your brain is trying to formulate a response to what you just heard and trying to process. And then another part of your brain is trying to share a response. Now, add all of that on top of, that feeling, that rush of anxiety that's just come over you. And no wonder you're frozen, and no wonder you're overwhelmed. So what we do in our racial equity training is that we start with creating a new practice of what our homies at Open Source Leadership Strategies here in North Carolina, some of our partners, they call it container building. And a container in this instance is an intentionally constructed environment where safety is valued, where we can mediate those anxiety kind of feelings or responses, and where we can hold the complexities of difficult conversations so that we can actively listen. We can consciously respond to whatever feelings that arise from those difficult conversations in as supportive a way as possible. And then we set some agreements at the beginning of the gathering. And we mean that everybody literally has to give like a physical response to agreeing with the agreement. So that could be like a head nod or right on, whatever. But there has to be some sort of physical or visual acknowledgement that everyone agrees on this set of agreements. And then we get people engaged through story sharing. We share an intentional prompt that's around food and race that allows people to tell their own stories, to revisit their memory and understand, like, over time, or to pull out an instance within their memory how race and food has shown up and interacted on a personal level. So that way we start to open the door for folks to begin to create that new practice that we were just talking about that will contribute to shifting that culture within our organizations and within our institutions, and then hopefully within our food system. And feel free to post questions throughout, especially if I'm moving too fast. So this next slide, I love this quote. This slide is just an acknowledgement that good intentions can sometimes have jacked up, not so good impacts. So the goal is not to rely on what we think we know to be true, but to be able to lean into discomfort so that we can live less out of habit and more out of intent, so that then we can have more positive, intentional, long-term, sustainable impacts and start to create that new culture that we're speaking of. So all this is a part of that initial section of container building. All right. So we didn't ask y'all this question this time around, but when we have folks register for our racial equity trainings here in North Carolina, we ask them, so why is this training important to your work? And as you can see on the screen, and I hope you're looking at the screen and not me, but these are some actual responses to those questions from folks who registered for some of our trainings. And as you can see on the screen, there's some words, a few words are highlighted in bold. And those terms represent some overarching themes among people within food systems work through our 4 or 5 or so trainings that we've conducted in terms of shared goals, shared purpose, overall significance of participating in these racial equity trainings. And what we can glean from these responses is, one, that people want to learn practice, not programs, which is a good thing because that's the point of the training. So that's good. And then the second thing is that people are looking both internally, individually, and organizationally, looking internally at their own organizations and their own practices, and then also looking externally out at the communities that are most impacted and that we're anchored in and that we serve. So that we can have a greater impact, especially within those communities. And then the third thing is that, which is kind of interesting, is that there's very little explicitness about who those communities are in terms of race and ethnicity. People have become kind of accustomed to using coded language like vulnerable or underserved or at risk or marginalized. That's another interesting thing that we see. And then the fourth thing is that people are thinking on 3 levels in their responses, whether they recognize it or not. They're thinking on, that individual level where they're saying, I want to better understand my own biases. I want to know what's in my own power to change or shift. And then they're also looking institutionally or organizationally where they're saying, I want to learn practices, processes, procedures. And then they're also looking culturally. How can I build community outside of my institutional walls? How can I better impact, how can my work have greater impact on marginalized communities? So that's kind of a cultural lens. So let's take a closer look at 2 aspects of our racial equity training that support some of the goals that people mention in responding to why this work is important, and also that speak to some of the goals that we hope to achieve in the training itself. So one is creating a shared analysis of racial equity, and that'll be that. For that, we use our 3 expressions tool, which I'm going to show you in a second. And then the other thing is creating a shared history of structural racism so that we can understand its current impacts. And for that, we use a historical timeline, which I am not going to show you because it's way too involved, but I'll kind of give you an overview of that. So we use this 3 expressions of racism tool that you see on the screen that was created by our homies at DR Works in our one-day racial equity training that we conduct. And we typically, debut this tool at around the midpoint of the day, just before we have folks walk through do a gallery walk of a historical US-based food systems and educational systems timeline, so that we can, one, begin to see the construction of race through policy in this country, and the hierarchy that causes some to benefit and some to be oppressed by it. And then the second thing is to identify institutional policies, practices, and procedures that reinforce our individual acts and inform our cultural beliefs and norms. And then understand how those reinforce the practices within our institutions. I mean, institutions that we are actually currently working in. So these things are active today in our current work. So from this initial framework, we can offer as a tool, we can offer this as an initial framework for people to begin strategizing, for people to actually begin strategizing in an inclusive way. They can start setting new goals where they start to intentionally consider, okay, so how are people of color, communities of color, marginalized, underserved, at risk, oppressed? You know, all those code words that we identified at the beginning, you know, of the webinar, that actually talk about the conditions of these communities, not the actual communities themselves. And then on the opposite side, it kind of helps us identify how white people or other privileged groups are included, served, validated, benefit. Okay. I hope this is making sense. So the other tool that we use is our shared history timeline. And so I can't go through the entirety of the timeline that we use, which DR Works and Open Source Leadership Strategies helped us to develop. It's literally in our training draped around the entire room. But I do want to pull some parallels from a Dr. King speech that he made at the 11th Annual Southern Leadership Conference Convention back in 1966, just so we can demonstrate the purpose of the tool. So bear with me. I'm going to switch out screens here real quick. And I'm going to share this brief clip here.
The good things in life, the Negro has approximately 1/2 those of whites. Of the bad things of life, he has twice those of whites. Thus, half of all Negroes live in substandard housing, and Negroes have half the income of whites. When we turn to the negative experiences of life, the Negro has a double share. There are twice as many unemployed. The rate of infant mortality among Negroes is double that of whites. And there are twice as many Negroes dying in Vietnam as whites in proportion to their size in the population. In other spheres, the figures are equally alarming. In elementary schools, Negroes lag 1 to 3 years behind whites, and their segregated schools receive substantially less money per student than the white schools. 1/20th as many Negroes as whites attend college. Of employed Negroes, 75% hold menial jobs. This is where we are. Where do we go from here?
So I'm switching screens again because I just learned this new skill and I'm very good at it now, apparently. But so very powerful clip. So the purpose, one purpose, as you can see, or that you probably heard from that clip, and it's the purpose of the timeline, is to make clear the disparity. And Dr. King, just in that 1 minute and 30 seconds, named 4 different areas of disparity for Black people in 1966. And so that's what our timeline does, is so we can see the disparity and how it's kind of evolved or either stayed the same over time. And then another purpose of the timeline is to help us identify institutions and how they've contributed to maintaining structural inequity, and see how historically and currently policies, practices, and procedures disproportionately affected communities of color, in this case Black communities, and how they still do. And another critical role that the history timeline plays is that it starts to introduce undeniable data, which we then try to correlate with stories of the lived experiences represented by that data, to show that data is really about people. It's about people's everyday lives. So those numbers that we see in the data represent actual people and actual whole communities. And another role of the timeline is, as you can see, I don't know if you can see my little arrow in this little image right here, is to just show the harshness and the violent reality of racism. And as a result, to kind of help people have a general understanding of the generational trauma that's created by racism and that racism continues to reinforce. And then I think there's such a lens on how that shows up in our food system. So just listen to the disproportions that Dr. King shared in that clip back in 1966. We can see that even though progress has been made, undeniably progress has been made, those disproportions, and we're looking specifically at Black communities because that's what Dr. King talked about in that clip, but the disproportions in Black communities still exist. In that speech in 1966, Dr. King states that unemployment in Black communities is twice, quote, twice that of whites. And if you look at the graph on the screen right now, or the chart on the screen, in 2017, you can see that still rings true today. And similar for poverty rates, similar for infant mortality rates. I couldn't find any numbers, any data from 1966 on food insecurity rates, but I can almost guarantee that those numbers are similar. Another of the significances of sharing this timeline is also evidenced in the clip we just heard, is to make more clear the role of both societal and institutional power in shaping the conditions of communities of color, marginalization, underserved, those are conditions. So the role of so the timeline makes clear the role of social and institutional power in creating those conditions. And then to show the racialized impact, as John Powell calls it, of those conditions. So, and I'm noticing that I start almost every sentence with the word so. I'm not sure what that means. But so this brings us to in our racial equity training to another shared goal, which is to develop a shared language and a shared definition around racism and structural racialization, so that we're not just focused on the individual impacts, but also looking at the structural impacts that directly create those conditions, like food insecurity, like poverty, like lack of access to opportunities in communities of color, so that we can then create strategies with those communities most impacted to address those root causes of disparity. John Powell, the dude you see on the screen, and someone who I have a lot of admiration for and really study his work a lot, but John Powell not only discusses racism, but also structural racialization, which he defines as quote, a set of processes that may or may not be animated by conscious forces, end quote. So kind of like that whole implicit bias thing that we keep hearing about. He calls it a, quote, web without a spider. And I love that analogy because my daughter's named after a spider, but that's a whole other webinar. So this is the part of the training when we encourage folks to think about those processes and practices within their organization. We ask the question, or we ask you to, at this point in the training, to answer the question, how can I use this culmination of tools to create a new set of processes? But now we have all these tools in place, so now we need a strong set of principles to ground these processes, and I'll share those in a slide or two. And once we understand the definitions of racism and structural racialization, then we can introduce the 4 foundations tool that can help us deepen our analysis and our understanding of this structural dynamic and how it operates. So this tool explains that where there is racism, there is privilege. Where there is racism, people in communities internalize that experience. Where there is privilege, people in communities internalize that experience. So we typically do this in a large group, mixed group, whole group, so that everyone is exposed to this concept that introduces power, how power operates. And so we start with, and I don't know if you can see my little button, but right here, this internalized racial supremacy or superiority quadrant, IRS, IRS for short. And ask white people in the training, what messages do you receive drawing from, their institutional and cultural experiences of racism, and what do you know based on your lived experience? What does this internalized racial superiority actually look like in your daily work? And some of the responses that we receive is that, okay, so one way it shows up in my daily work is in my grant writing. I may write a grant to serve communities of color without, or marginalized communities, or underserved communities, or underrepresented communities, without getting input from them. And why is that? Is because of my this culture that because I work in this institution, that I am the expert. So that's one example. And then we go to this next quadrant, IRO, internalized racial oppression or inferiority. And we ask people of color in the training, what messages do you receive about being a person of color, and how do you as a person of color internalize those messages, and how do they show up in your work? And some of the examples that we receive is that, sometimes I'm quiet because I don't want to put off, or I don't say as much in meetings, or I appear introverted because I don't want to come off as loud and angry and strong-willed, and as a result, my work often isn't valued in the same way. So from here, after going through this entire quadrant, then we do some identity caucusing, racial identity caucusing, where then we look at this, within our caucuses, look at this next chart to be able to try to provide some area of internal support and healing. And this was adopted from another great organization in North Carolina called BWA, run by Vivette Jeffries. So all of these, again, are tools to kind of help whole communities work through both the IRO and the IRS, how privilege and racism show up and manifest inherently and internally. So this leads us to another strategizing moment in our training, and a tool that revolves around this question that you see on our screen. And as I mentioned before, oftentimes we hear training participants say, I'm not an administrator in my organization. I don't run things, I don't have the power to make the changes that need to be made. So again, the question becomes, what is in your power to actually do? And then, so at this point, you're not asking this question in isolation, or at this point, you're not asking this question of yourself empty-handed. At this point, you've got several tools at your disposal. at this point in the training. So think about it. In your programs, especially if you're an extension, you likely have to create a set of goals or outcomes or objectives. So each time you do that, what if you started to develop the practice of using the 3 expressions tool? For each goal that you set, for each activity you create, you're asking, okay, so how are white people or other privileged groups included, served, financially resources, uplifted, validated? And then also asking the question, okay, so how are people of color, communities of color excluded, underserved, financially exploited, oppressed, invalidated? So you can do this every time you create a new activity or a new goal, just as a new practice. And then another example is, in terms of how you can use your tools post this training, is that when you create your meeting agendas, why not start with some of what we shared at the beginning, those container building activities, in order to build a collective community of decision makers that kind of rely on each other in a way that promotes a new level of trust building. So set those shared agreements, have everyone agree, have everyone add to if they want. Start with a breathing exercise. And I'm realizing I don't think I've breathed a lot during this presentation. But also have people start with a storytelling prompt, just to bring people into the room, and as a way to demonstrate that power here, at least in this space and in this moment for this meeting, is shared, and your opinions and your perspective is valued. So this is the tool, and to me, it's one of the most vital tools in our little racial equity toolbox, I think. And again, this is from our homies at DR Works. So this is the Taking Action for Racial Equity Principles. And we usually conclude our training by leaving participants with this final tool, and it's action principles, so that people can walk out of the door and feel like, okay, so I have something in my pockets, I have something in my toolbox that I can activate. And this grounds the practice of racial equity in your organization or institution going forward. It's kind of a gentle reminder of a couple of things. One, always start by involving and considering those most impacted by food systems disparities. Can't say that enough. Number two, to construct new institutions, new ways of operating, new ways of being, we need new tools. So use your tools. This is a toolbox. Activate it. Use it. The third thing is to remember that we are not operating in isolation. You're now part of a racial equity cohort. You're part of a group of food systems practitioners who are focusing on racial equity, and you now have support. You can lean on each other. And then, and finally, and I think equally important, is to start with what you have the power to do. And you can use all of these tools previously to help you kind of better understand what is in your power to do individually, institutionally, and culturally. So that's the meat of what I had on the bones. But I also want to share this kind of resource list that Rich kind of put together. Some great resources. I want to just highlight a couple. One is the bibliography that MSU Center for Regional Food Systems developed, which I think is dope, for lack of a better word. I think it's such a nice resource, just full of information, full of other resources. And then the Food First series is brilliant. A lot of really great leadership on that from voices on the ground, voices of true leaders on the ground. Center for Social Inclusion, I just have an affinity for that organization, and they also do some really great work from a policy lens, like marrying policy and the lived experience. Do some great writing, and that resource is a great one. And then the last one on the list, which is fairly recent, is from INFIS, and it stands for what it says there on the screen. I get it wrong every time, but it's a report on the role of land-grant universities and how we can help contribute to ending structural racism in the U.S. food system. It really does have some really good suggestions for things that we in land-grant universities and other institutions can activate. And I think we're going to share this list with you, but I think that you have to fill out the evaluation in order to get it. It's like a little carrot, dangling a little carrot in front of you. But this is actually a list of organizations that we created here in North Carolina that we used from the DR Works website, actually gleaned from the DR Works website, of organizations in North Carolina, in the southern region, and then around the country that we know of. I'm sure there's tons more, so feel free to help populate this list, but who do racial equity trainings. And one value within our organization that we try to support, because we not only conduct these trainings, but we feel like we're trying to institute a new practice ourselves within our organization, is that we try to build capacity of local, community-based, particularly people of color-led institutions that are and have been doing this kind of racial equity training for a long time. So even though we train, if an organization or institution comes up to us and say we have money to support a training for our organization, we encourage them to first look at this list and support these community-based organizations so that we can work on building capacity of these people of color, communities of color, grassroots-led organizations first and foremost. So I can breathe now. Just want to shout out again, DR Works, open source, this working group, which you'll have the opportunity to help us rename shortly. Also, I want to shout out our core team. I want to shout out CEFS and North Carolina State A&T for all of their work in this realm. And then all the legacy of leadership around racial equity over the years. So I'm going to open it up for questions right now, and I'll have somebody else help us out with that. So feel free to just, in your Q&A box, just type up any questions you have, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Thank you so much, Shorlette. And while I think we have a couple of questions that have come in already, and so if you have a question and you haven't asked yet, I would encourage you to type away, and I will read out your questions to Shorlette as they come in. A few people have asked, and so I just want to answer quickly, what type of follow-up materials will go out after the webinar. And so you should receive an email, as Shorlette was saying, I think with the PowerPoint slides, a recording of the webinar, a PDF listing some of the organizations that Shorlette just shared that do this type of training. And I'm not sure if I think that's all. If I'm forgetting anything, let me know. If you're interested in something else, let us know, and we can probably throw it in there. And now I see a bunch of questions, Shorlette, so I'm going to dive right in. The first is one that goes back to some of the language that you mentioned earlier on about sort of the code words that we use to talk about communities of color. And so this question comes, I think, from Kathy, and it says, I use the terms marginalized people and underserved communities to be more inclusive. That is to indicate that it's more than only Black people, brown people who are oppressed by racism. Should I specify communities? Or be more specific, using the terms Black, brown, red, LGBTQ? I am white.
That's a good question. I think it may, for me, the best answer is to ask the people that you're working with directly on how they prefer to be identified. And I think that, the purpose is to just kind of, again, peel back the layer so that we know who we actually are working with, who are those communities. And I think marginalized, underserved, those are, in my opinion, conditions of those communities. And so I don't see an issue. I don't think it's a either or. It can be a both and. And I'm open to, hearing what other people have to say about it. I don't necessarily think it's an either or kind of response. So I would definitely rely on the communities that are most impacted to self-identify.
Okay, thanks. And if anybody else has an experience with using various types of language that they want to share, again, please feel free to use the question and answer box for comments as well. The next question comes from Eric, who asks, to what extent have you been able to engage white farmers in this work, and what has been successful in doing so?
and others on the working group, feel free to chime in. But yeah, we've had some really good support from white farmers who come to our racial equity training. We've had a few farmers engage in our trainings, and then ask for some follow up. So it's not exclusive. I mean, it's very inclusive work, and we've been very fortunate in North Carolina to have farmers and come to our trainings, and we understand how important that is, because one of the principles is, you know who you can reach through your circle of influence, and those white farmers that come to our trainings have the ability to reach other farmers in a way that that I cannot. So everybody has a role to play, and we count on people to help us organize as a part of their roles, which we feel like we've had some level of success with.
Good, thank you. And if anybody has a follow-up question to their original question, please go ahead and type that in. In the meantime, the next question comes from Andrew, who asks, are there any opportunities in the Farm Bill struggle to stand up for racial justice concerns?
I think there's always opportunities. I mean, so I would say yes. But knowing that it is a struggle, especially right now, I mean, and I'm not an expert on the Farm Bill, so I'll yield to other people, but I feel like there's always an opportunity to try to push back and hold a line at the very least. So I would say yes. What those specifics are, I can't say, but I will actually refer you, and maybe we can send out a link when we send out the evaluation, that there's a webinar coming up on Thursday with the Heal Collaborative that is about the Farm Bill. So it's coming up on Thursday. So I would encourage people to, if you have the capacity, to check that out. HEAL, the Heal Collaborative.
Okay, great, thank you. So Lee asks, could you please tell us more about the range of trainings that you've conducted in North Carolina, content, partners, that type of stuff?
Well, our core team, and core stands for Committee on Racial Equity and Food Systems at CEFS, we've conducted as a team maybe 5 trainings, right? But 4 or 5 trainings at this point. And it ranged from, like I said, we had a few farmers in attendance, some board members from CEFS in attendance, chefs, NGOs, people from community-based organizations, and food councils. We had one that was targeting food policy councils around the state. The content is pretty much the same. It's kind of a general outline of what I ran through, minus a few nuggets, but for the most part, our training is a one-day training, and it looks similar to some of the things that I shared through the webinar. What was the other part of it?
I think content, partners.
Partners, shout out to DR Works and Open Source Leadership Strategies who help train. We have a 4-person training team that's multiracial. And so they've been very supportive in helping us build our facilitation skills and our training skills, and then help to identify, people that we should reach out to expand our core team.
Great, and this may be related. There's a question from Kathy that says, are there any groups in Austin, Texas doing any kind of work around this issue? I'm a non-GMO expert and new to the city and having a hard time communicating with folks on the ground. So Charlotte, I don't know if you know anything about the Austin area in particular, or if anyone else on the call is from that area and wants to chime in.
Yeah, I don't know nothing about Texas, unfortunately. I just that Beyonce's from there, but no, but yeah, maybe other people can chime in on that one. Yeah, I don't know of anybody in Texas.
The only thing I can think of, and I don't know that they are doing trainings, is Food for Black Thought, I think is based in Austin.
Okay.
So the next question comes from Catherine, who asks, what do you see as the value of framing racial equity work in the context of food systems? In other words, why advocate for food systems racial equity training versus racial equity trainings more broadly?
Because that's our lane. You know, I do advocate for racial equity training more broadly as well. But I think it's a part of our work, and so my part of my role is to share the relevance to the work that we do, which is food systems work. And I think that food is like one of the best avenues for people to understand and relate to why racial equity is important. It's just one, everybody eats, everybody consumes food, and then and you know, most people who work in food systems know that food does not magically appear on our plates, that it takes a certain amount of labor, it takes a certain amount of hard work. And we know that, you know, the people that have traditionally and currently labored for us to have food on our plates are primarily Black, Brown, Latino, immigrant people. And we know also we can look at, you know, the data that we just shared is that those same communities are the ones that are most food insecure. So I think looking at this through a racialized lens just makes a lot of sense, because it's just so apparent and it's so explicit. And I feel like it's a good, I'm always baffled that we have to convince people that that structural racism is alive and well within our food system. But if we do make the case, I think like looking at all of the inequities in the food system it makes the case easy to make, unfortunately, in my opinion.
Thanks. So the next question is from Mars, and I will editorialize just to say I think it touches on a question that people bring up a lot, which is, you know, I am interested in this work, or, you know, I and a sort of close group of colleagues are interested in this work, but we face resistance from senior administrators, from our board, from the people that we serve. So Mars's question is, how successful has the training on establishing a shared understanding of the history of inequity in the food system gone so far in North Carolina? I feel like there is still resistance to these ideas, and I wonder how challenging that step is and will be in extension.
Well, I mean, I don't want to give you the impression at all that we haven't hit roadblocks along the way. We've only started doing hosting and conducting trainings ourselves, say, over the past year or so. And our core team has gone through trainings before that, but it's been a long, hard road. I mean, honestly. So I don't want to give the impression that it's been easy and something that's happened overnight. So we started with people who were already drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit, if you will. You know, it wasn't people who we had to convince. So we incorporated that principle of looking at your circle of influence and then building out from there. You mentioned in the question that you have a small cohort of people who have an interest and a willingness. Start with that cohort and then think about who you can organize from there. Who are those people in your small cohort that they know that can then organize and bring in other folks? So start from where you are, start from what you know and what you have the power to do, which is what we did. We started with a very small group. So yeah, and we were very fortunate that within our organization that our leadership was willing as a part of that whole initial group of Kool-Aid drinkers. And so it made, in some respects, it made it easier, or at least made it less challenging. I won't say easier. So really, I would encourage you to think about your sphere of influence. Start with who you have, and then reach out from there. And I think just the testament that we had, I don't know how many people are on this actual webinar, but we've had over 500 people register. So, you know, if you're not getting with it by now, you're going to be behind the curve. I mean, I think this is kind of the next area that we as an organization, as extension, is looking at in terms of, you know, where the need is and where the interest is. And also our students in our institutions won't allow us to keep just glazing over these topics. They expect more from us, and they expect us to be able to address these issues effectively.
Thanks. So the next question is from Sobrato, and I think sort of the heart of the question is, can you talk about inequity in the food system versus racism in the food system. I'm not sure that I am quite grasping the heart of the question, but I think it's sort of asking if there's a difference, or is there something to say about inequity instead of racism?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I don't know. It feels loaded, so I'm scared.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, but
Okay.
yeah, but this lens and this particular webinar is on structural racism in the food system. And just to be clear, we use this framework as kind of an entry point to look at other areas of oppression and other areas of privilege. So it's not done in isolation. We wear a lot of different identities, and our systems are influenced and by all of them. So I don't want to, we start with this lens of structural racism as a means to racial equity and as a lens to food security, but it's not exclusive. So it's not exclusively race, but it's always race. Is why we start with race, but we don't see race as the endpoint. We know that there are other areas of oppression as well.
Okay, thanks, Shorlette. So the next question is from Carolyn, and she's wondering if you have any advice or experience for introducing these concepts in a neutral or hostile nonprofit workspace. She writes, I have some coworkers who potentially make a strong cohort, but the landscape is generally disinterested / openly opposed to thinking about systems shifting in terms of working with the community we serve, having a statement of inclusion, etc.
And I would love for other members of our working group to chime in if they feel comfortable. But again, I wouldn't say hostile. I don't know if that's the right word for how we began our work, but everybody was not on board. And so I think that, even, I'll speak from a personal level. Like I've actually transitioned in how I communicate our work and how I try to engage people in the work. And I'm okay. I have to be okay at some point with the fact that, we're not gonna have everybody off gate. We have to organize. We have to organize, and we have to keep building out that sphere of influence. So we start with who we are and what we can do, what we have in our own power to do, and then we build out from there. And some of these, feel free to reach out. I feel like some of these are more, more have like a lot more substance behind it. So if you want to reach out to me personally, and we can kind of talk through some of these specific things, I'm happy to try to make time to do that as well. But yeah, I think that's the reality of it. Talking about race is a very difficult conversation. And so that's why I feel, and what we have learned within our organization, is that having that grounding of a shared analysis is important. It really is. It's really important. And in order to, what John Powell says, have a more sophisticated conversation about race, is sometimes we have to determine on which of those three levels or those expressions is the best place to start: the individual, the cultural, or the institutional. Some people may not, and a lot of times, and I would say that we've seen in our training, is that when we start on the individual level, it starts a lot of defensiveness. And so we may start on the cultural or institutional level as an entry point.
Thanks, Shorlette, and thanks for the generous offer to try to talk more with some people on a one-on-one basis. So we can include Shorlette's email in the follow-up materials that go out. So if you want to keep the conversation going with her, you'll have her contact information. Kyle asks or says, funding this systems level change takes a different funder mentality than simply funding programs. What funders in the food sector are actively doing this?
I can only speak to our work. We've had support from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, some pretty long-term support. And then we've also had some support from Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation here in North Carolina. Those are just a couple off tops that I can think of. And I'm sure maybe some of the other members of the working group that represent other institutions can maybe shout out some of their organizations or some of their funders as well. But yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of, or more and more progressive, or funding sources that are thinking a little more progressively in terms of how we address food insecurity, particularly in our food system. So,
Shorlette, this is Rich Pirog, and a number of the funders that are part of the Sustainable Ag and Food System Funders Network are committed to equity. And for those that want to get more information about that network, that's SAFS, Sustainable Ag Food Systems Network, SAFSN.org. Food system, I'm sorry, let me say it again. S as in Sam, A as in Andrew, F as in Fred, S as in Sam, F as in Fred again, .org. SAFSF, SAFSF.org. Thank you.
cool. Thank you.
That'll be a good lead into our naming discussion, which will hopefully come up a little bit later. But in the meantime, we have a number of questions to still go through. And so one is just, our next one is a comment from Kelsey regarding the earlier question about the Farm Bill. And she writes, support funding for 2501 program. Then next, Karen writes, we're launching a new pilot campaign in the Raleigh area this fall as part of a national campaign effort to make healthy plant-based food more accessible in schools and restaurants around the country. We would love to hire your team to do a racial equity training for us. Are you able to travel, or do you only do
Raleigh?
training?
You're up the street.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, I would take a look at that list because, as I mentioned before, we try to incorporate a practice of racial equity too. So if you do have funding, we want to encourage you to support and build capacity for people of color-led training organizations that might be in the area. And there are a few in North Carolina. We're very fortunate that way. We have some really, I just censored myself in my head. I didn't say some baller, some baller leadership in North Carolina. So, so if you want to reach out to me directly, I can share that with you. But yeah, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to some of those amazing organizations that do racial equity and social justice training.
Great. Then Renee asks, what types of changes have you seen in the food system based on white farmers participating in racial equity training? And back to this funding question, how many hours or maybe that's not a funding question, just a nuts and bolts question. How many hours / sessions does training consist of?
Our training that we conduct, for one, I'm not really sure how to answer the first question. I mean, we've seen them show up at trainings. I've actually done a few panels with some white farmers who just kind of reinforce some of the things that they've gleaned from the trainings, which I think is, it can be game changer that people who have that power and privilege to put these kinds of conversations on the front end. Now, I mean, I feel like I was saying before, we can only do so much within the walls of the institutions that we're in, but we've had farmers, white farmers in particular, to name the conditions and be very explicit about that, which I feel like is an important willingness to start with. In terms of how many hours, the training that we host and conduct, and actually, and when we got the support of DR Works to help us craft our training or design our training, we had farmers in mind. We had people who may only be able to commit a day, because the trainings that we went to were 2 days long, 2 full days, and we recognized, everybody can't do that, depending on what kind of organization or institution or job you have. It's kind of a privilege to be able to do that. So we work with them to kind of whittle down our training to a 9 to 5, 9 to 4 usually training. So it's usually a day-long training. So yeah, was there a cost question?
No, I made that part up. It was a question about length of time.
Okay. No, we don't charge for our trainings, but we want to be able to support, like I said, grassroots organizations who could use the resource building capacity that our institutions can provide by hiring, POC-led trainers to do these trainings, especially if you have a couple of days to invest. I think it's worth taking that deep dive on.
Great, thanks. So the next question is from Nicole, who writes, we have started to include racial inequity in our food systems in our farmer training, and it is taught by me, a white woman. Participants have asked for this to be delivered by people of color, but from what I've learned in other trainings, it is one of my responsibilities as a white person to teach about this racism and not put it on the shoulders of people of color to teach us. How do I share this or help participants to understand this? We have people of color involved in the development of our curriculum, and they do teach in other sessions.
I can only speak to how we've organized our training team. We intentionally have a multiracial team, and we feel like that's important because, one, we caucus in our trainings, and so we have white people lead the white people caucus, and people of color lead the people of color caucus, and then so I think that's in some ways I see, in a lot of ways, in most ways I see where that question is coming from and why that's important. So I feel like if there's an opportunity to build that mechanism into having a multiracial training cohort, I think that's a good approach. At least it's a good approach for us. And I also understand that sometimes that's not possible. So I won't answer that question for you, but I'll just offer that information so you can kind of weigh it to determine, what might work best for you and your group.
Yeah, and I think that's useful feedback. So the next question comes from an anonymous attendee who writes, I work with a group of community organizers to build a food co-op in a Black neighborhood that is being gentrified. What is the best way to explain to white people who say we are discriminating against whites when we are looking to have at least 40% of our leadership be people of color?
I think you just frame it as a principle. It's an organizational principle. And if they think that, I don't necessarily, I don't know that if it's your responsibility to change the way they think. Your responsibility is to offer a reasonable explanation that's grounded in your analysis. I mean, and then organize. I think that's the best explanation you can give. I mean, because I think if you try to, and again, it's the Kool-Aid drink. I'm saying it's how you organize. It's building that sphere. I'm serious, y'all. I'm not even joking when I say that. I rely on these tools a lot, and so I really, after you go through that training and you do get this set of tools, I feel like it's important. Like especially even for questions like that, I feel like you can rely on your tools to help build an analysis for a response. It may not be an answer or a solution, but it's a response, and it's a quality response that's rooted in your principles. So people can debate it, but they can't deny it because it's rooted in your organizational and institutional principles around racial equity. And so one thing that we've had to do continuously is just kind of rely on that. And we started by being defensive, and we found that we don't really gain a whole lot. We just this is our line, and this is why we take this approach. And then we can constantly rely on those values to be reinforced. And so it wouldn't hurt to understand your purpose, or at least write that out, understand your purpose around incorporating racial equity into your work, and then be able to share that and communicate that effectively, like with your eyes closed, like in your sleep. You know what I'm saying? So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Shorlette. So the next question comes from Alexis, who would like to know, what approaches or models besides trainings do you see that are working to increase racial equity in the food system?
Again, I would refer you to the Challenge of Change report that was shared on the resource page. Some really good examples of action steps that could turn into models and approaches. And, and I think that I don't want to give the impression, I feel like y'all know better, that this kind of work of racial equity work, or it's not just starting. There's a history of amazing food systems work that's been forgotten about or overlooked, just like co-ops, that started like back in the day with some organizations like the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, who uplifted the Black cooperative movement with W.B. Du Bois. So I feel like there's a history of, like, let's not lose the history of associated that was especially the history of communities of color in farming, agriculture, and food systems that has been forgotten about. So there are several models that are about racial justice, that are racial justice focused throughout the country, particularly in the South. I'm biased, but I think there are a lot of good examples in the South of amazing food systems work that has happened historically and over the years.
Great. And so I think this next question is probably more for the group than for Shorlette, but there's someone who would like to know if there is a group in Northwest Arkansas. So if anybody who's on the webinar knows of racial equity training type groups in the Arkansas area, please feel free to answer in the question and answer box. And along those same lines, I think for Kathy, there are a couple suggestions in there now of people in the Austin area who you can reach out to. The next question, or possibly a comment, comes from Mallory, who says, I don't want to expect people to volunteer their time while I'm getting paid. And I do think that brings out an important issue that, you don't want to
I agree.
unfairly burden people. So I don't know if you encountered that in your work, Shorlette, or if you have or can share experiences about how you have approached that issue. I think that is important.
I think that's important too, and I feel like we're currently internally looking at some of our organizational policies, and one is to really hey, Rich's belly. One is to have an explicit commitment of how much of our, like, say if we get a grant, like the percentage of grant funding that lands in that community, for example. So being explicit about that commitment, and and not having the expectation that because we have a young woman who's on our training team that's not a part of our organization necessarily. So we make sure that she's paid for her time, that she's paid for her travel, and all those kinds of things. So I think that's actually it's the beginning of a good set of principles, and I think the struggle is like, so how can you make that happen? So I totally agree with that, and labor comes in all forms. And I feel like that's been one challenge. Like, how do we compensate people for their emotional labor, for their time? And, so I would love to continue that part of the conversation and hear what other people are doing to make sure that that's a priority.
Okay. Yeah. So if anybody wants to add their own experience with this issue of compensating people for their work around these issues, please feel free to add that in the question and answer area. Yeah, Rich?
Yeah, Lucy, we're as we're monitoring this, as we're seeing some of our participants starting to drop off here, we thought what we'd do is we would bring up the poll question now, and then we could continue to answer questions.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
So if we can go to that slide.
And actually, I'll just bring the poll up too. So
okay.
There we go.
Okay, so folks, this is Rich Pirog, Center for Regional Food Systems, and what we shared, what Lucy and Shorlette have alluded to, is we would like to get some feedback on the name of our working group. The current name is Undoing Inequality in the Food System Working Group, and we have been not that pleased with it, so we really would like to hear your opinions and to pick the top 2 choices of the 4 that you see there in the poll question. It's the only poll question we have for you, and please complete this, and as you're completing this, we will go back, Lucy, to you facilitating questions for Shorlette or perhaps for any of us. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you in advance for your feedback on our name. As we have seen in the conversation, there's all sorts of acronyms floating around out there, so we're hoping to get something that captures what we're trying to do, but that also is easy to say and remember. All right, there's a comment from Andrew back to the question about the Farm Bill, which says, for starters, we can fight against work requirements and mandatory drug testing to receive SNAP benefits, support and generously fund program 2501 for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, and strengthen, don't weaken regulations on pesticides that poison mostly people of color working in the fields. So I'll just leave that one out there, but in case anybody's just calling in and can't read those questions, that's another response to the Farm Bill issue that was raised earlier. The next question asks, if folks are new to this, what is the one question you'd recommend they ask themselves as they are making a decision through an equity lens? Oh, Shorlette, I think you're muted.
When can I attend a training? No, what is in my power to do? And if it's organizing a training or finding funding to support a training, then that I would say that would be the next step to get that grounding. So what is in my power to do?
Okay, great, thank you. Then Matthew asks, have you directly worked with, or do you have any examples of food policy councils that have improved their racial equity lens? Alternatively, if you feel like calling it out, do you think food policy councils aren't doing a good job addressing the racialization of the food system?
No, I'm not calling anything out. I feel like we've had a lot of willingness in North Carolina amongst the food councils that we work with. Some of them have a good, and I think this is important, I feel like this is kind of the role of diversity. They have a solid racially diverse mix of people on their councils, and so we get a lot of perspectives. We get a lot of what gaps are missing because of that diversity at the table. So so I feel like there's been some willingness. I'm not sure. We haven't really developed what success means in terms of racial equity amongst that particular group, racial equity work amongst that group in particular. But I have definitely seen a willingness here in North Carolina.
Thanks. So the next question is from Kim, who asks, what have you observed is effective in changing hearts and minds? Oh, sorry. What have you observed is effective in changing hearts and minds?
Craft beer. No. No, I mean, I think I think personal stories has been one. I mean, and within the institutions that we work in, there's also people who need data to be convinced. So I think it's kind of an individual thing in some ways, but I think that's a really good point that you bring up, is that it's both head and heart work. And we've noticed that working in, say, academic circles, that we have to get a lot of participants out of their head, and thinking, and also recognizing the heart work of it. And then, and sometimes opposite with, say, younger youth groups, they're very fired up because of their just straight up passion. So I think it's a both and kind of thing.
All right, and then I think the next is a comment from Sarah, who says she loved your presentation, Shorlette. Thank you, especially the areas where you encouraged us to recognize our power. And then she says, I found this quote really helpful in my work, and maybe others will too. And then the quote is, look for where your privilege intersects somebody's oppression. That is the piece of the system that you have the power to help destroy.
Right on. I'm with that. I might add that to a slide or two. Do you know who said that? Whose quote is that? Is that a quote?
It is a quote, and I was purposely not reading the name because I'm
okay. It's all good.
I'm going to butcher it, but it's Ijeoma Olu.
Okay.
It'll be in there spelled
Okay.
properly, and I apologize that I can't
Okay.
pronounce it. Let's see. There's a resource suggestion from Eric's, who says Racial Equity Tools has some good resources about identifying leverage points from where you are to impact systems. Some of this information can be found in their Transforming White Privilege curriculum.
That's a good one. I'm glad you shouted that one out.
The next question asks, what tools or metrics do you recommend for measuring racial equity in food systems change?
There's a ton out there. I don't have any specific recommendation, but we're working on compiling a list. So I would say visit our website in the next little bit. Hopefully it could host that list. But there's a ton out there.
Okay. And so is that
I think the Center for Social Inclusion is one website that's now, I think, merged with Race Forward. So they have a lot of good tools on their website. So that's just one shout out I can name.
And your website, Shorlette, just so people remember, is the Center for Diversified. Environmental.
Yeah, Center for Environmental Farming Systems. Go under Food Systems Initiatives and click on Committee on Racial Equity Core. It's not up there now, but we're developing tools to share. We actually do a monthly reading and discussion group called In Betweens. We have a guide for that we're hoping to share as well. So.
Cool. So the next question says, as consumers of food, what changes can we advocate for or support with our food dollars that incentivize a more equitable food system?
I'll let some of the other people chime in. Some of the other.
That's fine. All right. So if anyone out there
may have a better perspective on some of these things,
wants to tackle that question about what we can advocate for as consumers, please feel free to add it to the question and answer box. Next, Justin is wondering.
Well, I'll just say being intentional about what communities you invest in, where you spend your money. If you can, support Black farmers or farmers of color as often as you can. Help build that infrastructure. Support, even if you do trainings, like I said before, support people of color-led organizations that do these kinds of trainings.
Okay, thanks, Shorlette. So the next question is from Justin, who writes, based on your experience, what frameworks or methods would you recommend for evaluating the outcomes and impact of your work to promote racial equity in the food system? And it sounds like maybe we already answered that question of check out their website, and either there are now or there will be coming soon a list of resources.
And there's a ton of resources out there. And, most of the things that we develop, we develop with the support of other organizations. Like if you go to the DR Works website, and it could be just dismantlingracism.org, they've actually, I don't think they do trainings any longer. Some of their trainers may still train, but they've turned their website into an entire workbook. And but we always say in doing our racial equity work that we really, really encourage people to go through a training before they just start throwing out tools all over the place, or sharing tools, or trying to because it could go bad quick. We know from experience, just because we didn't have a grounding in a shared analysis and we weren't prepared to have a more sophisticated conversation around race, as John Powell says. So yeah, I would really encourage you to have a process in place before diving in.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. So the next question is also a resource question, and it may just be a question of sharing again what you already have, because I think I have seen you share some of this stuff in other contexts. But Eric wants to know, would you have specific authors and writers you would recommend? And have you tried story circles as a starting point?
Yeah, I think story circles are great. And yes, I think the bibliography link that's from MSU contains a lot of the things that I fall back on any of John Powell's work, any of Ruby Sales' work, just to have a broader perspective that on how all of these conditions kind of intersect each other. Michelle Alexander's work, but really, I would really check out that bibliography resource from MSU. It's really comprehensive. It's dope.
Okay, so the next question comes from Tobias, and this may actually be one that folks at MSU are better prepared to answer, but Tobias says, thank you for your honesty in a somewhat difficult subject. I'm very pleased that you kept it real and have been open to discussion. And then the question is, can you provide support to farmers in Michigan, especially for women farmers? And so I would imagine maybe that Rich and his center might have resources in that area.
We would, and that we could talk about. There's several projects that are focused on women farmers. Check out our website and or contact me, and I'll get you connected to the right person. Just type MSU CRFS, and you'll find our website. Okay,
so Tobias, it looks like check out MSU Center for Regional Food Systems and get in touch with them, and they can probably help you out. The next question is from Nicodemus. And Nicodemus, I apologize if I have butchered your name. And this question is, can you share more specific examples of the inequities experienced by farmers, producers, growers, and others in the food system? How are organizations addressing these challenges in farming? So this may be a data question or a story question.
I'll also let other people chime in, but I think there's, I think the Pickford case is an example of historical discrimination embedded in, federal institutions that directly impacted the legacy of farming and farm work over time for, at the time, minority farmers. And I think some good organizations to look to uncover those stories is the Loss Prevention Project here in North Carolina, and also Monica White, and I think she's up y'all's way, maybe.
Maybe she's at the University of Wisconsin.
Yeah, University of Wisconsin, who's done some amazing work and research around that question. And there was a resource just released, maybe it's through the Center for Social Inclusion, Race Forward, looking at racial inequity in food hubs, and has a historical lens on that by Dara Cooper. So there's some resources out there that I would encourage you to look at as a starting point. And again, it's an onion. There's so many layers to it.
All right. The next question is another resource question, and this comes from Katie, who writes, I work in communications for a university center that addresses food insecurity, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. Are there any resources, books, etc., or trainings you can recommend that would draw connections between the disparities that occur in U.S. food systems and in Malawi food systems, for example?
I'm not aware of any specifically. I'll let other people chime in if they are, but our training is in the context of a U.S. food system, so I'll be honest about that, and I would love to have more of a global perspective. So would love any resources that you would have to share that might parallel some of the work that we're doing.
Okay, yeah, so we'll throw that one out there then for...
Rich want to chime in.
Oh, go ahead, Rich, sorry.
Just going to say we have a staff member, Center for Regional Food Systems, that works probably 20% of her time in Malawi. And again, that question you could send our way. We may be able to get a follow-up response.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll just add, if anybody in the audience has some information about inequities in the food system from a global perspective or a comparative perspective, please feel free to add those to our question and answer. The next question is from Stephanie, who would like to know, do you have suggestions for providing equitable access to good food jobs for people without college degrees or the resources to take that path?
These are some great questions, and you know, I don't have all of the answers. And I feel like there's so much amazing work going on the ground, a lot of community-based work, and I feel like a lot of communities are being very self-determined and creating those opportunities for themselves. Here in North Carolina, through CEFS, we have a network called the Food Youth Initiative. So it's youth-based food systems organizations around the state, and our role is to convene those youth groups, have them work and vibe with each other, and then another role of ours as this institution is to help support internships to create a career ladder into food systems jobs. So to me, that's another way as an institution of privilege of how we can activate our privilege. Like, we're a conduit for these relationships between, people who are looking for young people, innovative young people to hire in food systems for food systems jobs, and the young people that we are working with that are mostly young people of color. And shout out to Bevlin, who's a part of our core team who leads that effort. So we're trying to create new pipelines to opportunity for young people. And I think that's one role that institutions like ours can play.
Great. So the next question is, says, I'm from Kentucky, only person of brown skin at my job. Kentucky has a good old boy system. We are trying to intentionally wake people up to the inequalities of our food system and in our community. Most of our staff and board are white people who have never had a conversation with Black people, especially not on the topic of agriculture. With that said, what should be the first step? I don't think training should be first. Basic knowledge would be the first step, right?
Yeah, first of all, I trust your judgment on that one. I mean, you know your community, the folks you're working with. So I do trust that if you don't think training should be the first step, it should not be the first step. I do think there's an organizing component there, so I think like having a conversation with people in your, again, your sphere of influence, and then maybe from the conversation, you can bring in other people who they may be able to reach that you may not be able to reach. And I think like having a community based where it's people within your institution and outside of your institution. So even if you're in a predominantly white institution, which is same for me, in predominantly white leadership, predominantly white institution, well, white leadership, not predominantly white, but a predominantly white institution, how can you start building that muscle of this predominantly white institution to be ready to address those issues, to be more equipped to establish those principles once you do get the diversity in the makeup of the institution that you want. So there is work to do in the meantime, and I would just start with organizing, and like you said, have those conversations, and then start with that small cohort, and then try to work on a training or something so you can incorporate a set of principles that can help you move forward. And I would refer back to that taking actions principle sheet. And also if you want to chat more, feel free to reach out to me personally, because we're in the same jam.
Okay, wow. Lucy and Shorlette, we are approaching 4:30. And there is still more than 25 questions, so we probably are not going to finish them. But we, talking here to Gwen, we will be able to follow up all of these questions. We should be able to follow up and respond to the individuals asking the questions. And so I think we do need to go ahead and close at this time. And I'm going to ask you, Shorlette, if so that we can close, if you would advance the screen so that we can share one event and then just say thank you. And before we do this, Shorlette, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to make? Just so you know, you probably answered about 50 questions, which in the last 45 minutes, which I don't. We've received 100 questions, just so that everybody that's still on knows. That's close to a record for our IT person who does a bazillion webinars. And so that again, that says something. But Shorlette, any last comment?
I just want to thank everybody for the questions and curiosity, and thanks for being engaged. And I don't have all the answers, so I don't want to give the impression that I do. It's just I'm just offering, offering suggestions based on what we've learned from our work. So I do trust your expertise where you are, and would love to continue to engage the conversation if you'd like to. So thank y'all. Thanks to the working group. Thanks to the TA, Gwen behind the scenes, and Kelsey for organizing the way she organized things.
Thank you, Shorlette. And again, recognizing the whole team, Lucy, Kelsey, Shorlette, and Rachel in South Dakota, and also Gwen here with MSU Extension IT, who is making everything also run smoothly. This work group, even though our funds focus on extension staff, we work with all kinds of educators that work in the food system space. And there were several questions about what might be next, including for extension. And this is an example of something that shows you the change that we hope to see on this issue within cooperative extension. There's going to be a national training for extension in the end of August. For those of you that are still on that are extension educators, this is just a heads up. A letter is going to be sent out to, and a webinar for extension directors in all 50 states. It'll be tentatively at the 4-H Conference Center, and we hope to have teams of 3 people from cooperative extension. That's not just the 1862 schools, but the 1890 institutions and the tribal colleges as well. And it'll be an in-depth 1-week training. Other than sleeping, you'll be working about 16 hours in immersion on civil dialogue and racial equity. And the idea is to go back to your states and increase the competency for extension. Remember, there's 30 to 40,000 extension employees around the country. So this is a group that we need to be able to continue to raise their competency over time. So this is something we want you to just have on your radar screen. And the idea here is not to limit this after the national training, but to have more competent extension staff work with other organizations in their states, in their communities, on the whole idea of civil dialogue and racial equity. And the contact person here is a colleague of mine at Mississippi State, who's also working with Alcorn State in Mississippi on this, Rachel Wellborn. And again, this will be part of the slides. And last slide, Shorlette, this is one more. On behalf of Lucy or Rachel, do you have any last comments? Kelsey, you haven't said anything. You want to say something?
I don't have any additional comments, but thanks everyone for engaging. And there's been lots of wonderful feedback about Shorlette and her content and just everything. So thanks, guys.
Shorlette, basically, the summing it up in 2 words, all the feedback said Shorlette rocks. Just so you know, that's what it basically came down to.
So many, even in all capital letters. Shorlette rocks.
All caps. So, Rachel, any final thoughts?
No, I would just like to thank everyone for participating today. It's great to see the really active question and answers and dialogue that is rare often on webinars. And also thank you for the feedback about our name. We really appreciate it. If you have any other thoughts or comments about how a group like this could be useful for you, whether or not you're an extension, please let us know. We'll be sending out follow-up materials, and that should include all the relevant email addresses. So if you want to just shoot us an email and let us know what we can do, we would really appreciate it. And thanks.
And the winner of the poll was Racial Equity in the Food System as a name that got 50%. As Lucy said, we'll be sending a link to a post-webinar survey. The slide deck is a PDF, the recording link, those great resources that Shorlette just gave you a sneak peek on.
You say info about the training.
And info about the training. And this is a first of a series that we will do with this funding from the Kellogg Foundation. So stay tuned. We're a small but mighty group. We also are recruiting a few other additional people to join the steering committee, and we've had 1 or 2 questions about that. Give us a holler and we could engage you on that. thank you all so much, and thank you again, Gwen, for your help. And now I think it's we want you all to continue your own journey. And on behalf of the working group at Shorlette, peace out from everybody.
Mm.